Some secrets are not lies. They are simply griefs that never found the right moment to be spoken. And when a young princess found a ring hidden inside a wall that had not been touched in 30 years, she did not know she was about to hold a piece of a woman's whole life in her palm. A life that came before the crown, before the king, before anyone thought to ask the queen who she had been before she became who they needed her to be. What Aloan found that afternoon would test every bond in the royal family. Because the truth, once found, does not stay quiet for long. The old west wing of Ashworth Castle had not been opened in over 3 decades. Dust sat thick on the windowsills, and the velvet curtains had faded to the color of weak tea. It was Princess Aloan's idea to restore it, a small wing, once used as a private study by the Queen's late mother-in-law, now meant to become a nursery for the growing royal family. Nothing grand, nothing that anyone thought would matter beyond fresh paint and new furniture. Aloan had always been the kind of woman who liked to work with her hands, even now, years into her royal life. She still remembered how, as a young woman marrying into the family of King Edmund, she had been warned constantly about protocol, what to say, what not to say, how to stand, how to smile for cameras that never seemed to stop flashing. But nobody had warned her about silence, about how many silences lived inside a palace. How every hallway held a version of a story nobody dared finish. She hadn't expected to find anything the day she walked into that old study with a team of restorers, checking on cracked plaster near a bricktop section of the west wall. The workers said it looked like an old fireplace that had been sealed shut generations ago, likely for safety reasons. When they opened it to inspect the flue, something metallic clattered onto the stone floor. A small wooden box warped by decades of damp air, its hinges rusted stiff. Aloan almost didn't look inside. It could have been nothing, an old keepsake, a childhood trinket, something forgotten by a servant long since retired or passed on. But something about the box made her kneel down anyway. Perhaps it was instinct. Perhaps it was simply the quiet of the room, the way the afternoon light fell across the dusty floor like it was waiting for her to notice something. Inside, wrapped in a scrap of faded blue cloth, was a ring. Not the kind of jewelry found in royal collections, no diamonds, no elaborate crest, nothing that matched the family's known heirlooms. It was simple. A thin gold band with a small, worn engraving on the inside, to R always. C. Aloan turned it over in her fingers for a long moment. R. Rosalind. It had to be. Everyone in the family called the Queen R, only in old letters, back before her wedding to King Edmund, back when she was simply Lady Rosalind Ashcombe, a quiet noblewoman from the countryside who had married into royalty later in life than most expected. But who was C? She almost put it back. She told herself it was none of her business, that whatever lay behind those initials belonged to a life the Queen had lived long before Aloan ever entered this family. But something about the way the box had been hidden, bricked into a wall and sealed away, told her this was not something forgotten by accident. This was something buried on purpose. That evening, Aloan mentioned the discovery casually to her husband, Crown Prince Tobias, while they sat by the fire in their private quarters. "Found an old ring in the west wing today," she said, keeping her voice light. "Engraved with a C, any idea who that might be?" Tobias looked up from his book, his brow furrowing slightly. "A ring? Where exactly?" "Bricked into the old fireplace." "Hidden, really?" He was quiet for a moment, then he shook his head. "I don't know, might be worth asking my mother, but—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "She doesn't talk much about her life before she married my father. Never has." Aloan nodded, though something in her chest tightened. She had always admired Queen Rosalind, a woman who carried herself with quiet dignity, who had weathered years of public scrutiny with grace, who had never once in Aloan's memory spoken about her life before the palace. She had assumed it was simply reserved nature. Now she wondered if there was more to it. She decided not to ask the Queen directly, not yet. Instead, she did what she always did when curiosity got the better of her. She went looking for answers on her own, quietly, carefully, the way she had learned to move through palace life without drawing attention. The following week, she visited the royal archives, a place few members of the family bothered to enter unless required for official research. The archivist, an elderly man named Mr. Pemberton who had worked there for over 40 years, greeted her warmly. Aloan asked, as casually as she could manage, about records from before Queen Rosalind's marriage to King Edmund. "The Queen's family records?" Mr. Pemberton asked, adjusting his glasses. We have some, not much from before she married in, of course. She wasn't royalty then, just landed gentry. Her family's estate was in Millbrook Hollow, if I recall. Millbrook Hollow, Alowan repeated. Do you have any local records from there, parish registers, that sort of thing? Mr. Pemberton gave her a curious look but didn't press. I can check. May I ask what this is about, Your Highness? Just family history, Alowan said, offering a smile that she hoped looked more casual than she felt. I like knowing where we all come from. It took several days, but eventually Mr. Pemberton returned with a thin folder of documents, old parish records, a handful of letters that had been donated to the archive decades ago by a local historical society, and a single black-and-white photograph that made Alowan's breath catch. It showed a young woman, unmistakably a much younger Rosalind, standing beside a tall man in simple working clothes, both of them smiling in a way that seemed almost too unguarded, too joyful to belong to the composed Queen Alowan knew. On the back of the photograph, in faded pencil, someone had written, Rosalind and Callum, Millbrook Hollow, Summer. Callum C. Alowan sat with the photograph for a long time before she read through the letters. They were correspondence between Rosalind and a family friend, written when Rosalind was in her early 20s, years before she ever met King Edmund. The letters spoke fondly, tenderly, of a young blacksmith named Callum Doyle, a local man Rosalind had grown close to, someone she had clearly loved deeply. There was no scandal in the letters, nothing shameful. Just the plain, ordinary story of two young people who had cared for each other in a small village before life carried them down different paths. One letter, dated only a few months before what would have been Rosalind's wedding to Callum, mentioned wedding preparations. A simple village wedding, nothing like the grand affairs Alowan had grown used to at the palace. And then, abruptly, the letters stopped. The final document in the folder was a newspaper clipping, yellowed and brittle, reporting an accident at a local quarry. Callum Doyle, aged 26, had died in a rockslide while working, just weeks before he and Rosalind were meant to marry. Alowan sat back in her chair, the pieces settling into place. Rosalind had loved someone before King Edmund, had planned to marry him, had lost him in the cruelest, most sudden way. And somewhere in the years that followed, she had come to the palace, met King Edmund, and built an entirely new life, one that never once mentioned the man she had once promised her whole future to. It wasn't scandalous. It wasn't a betrayal of anyone. It was simply grief, folded up and hidden away, the way people sometimes hide the parts of themselves that hurt too much to look at directly. But not everyone in the palace would see it that way, and Alowan was about to learn that she was not the only one who had gone looking. 3 days after her visit to the archives, Alowan received an unexpected note, slipped beneath the door of her private study by a servant who claimed not to know who had sent it. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate, clearly disguised. You are not the only one who has found what the Queen buried. Some truths are worth more than silence. Alowan read the note twice, her hands going cold. Someone else knew. Someone else had been looking, and whoever they were, they did not sound like they intended to keep the discovery quiet out of kindness. She thought immediately of Duchess Seraphina, a distant cousin of the king's, a woman who had never quite hidden her ambition to see her own branch of the family rise higher in influence and favor. Seraphina had always been polite to Alowan's face, but there had long been a coldness beneath the courtesy, a sense that she was always calculating, always watching for an opening. Alowan didn't have proof, not yet, but instinct told her the note had come from Seraphina's circle, if not from the Duchess herself. That night, unable to sleep, Alowan sat by the window of her chambers, turning the small gold ring over in her fingers. She thought about Queen Rosalind, the woman who had welcomed her into the family with open warmth, who had never once made her feel like an outsider despite the weight of royal expectation. She thought about the king, a man devoted to his wife in a way that had always seemed unshakable. And she thought about what it would mean if this secret, gentle and sad as it was, fell into hands that intended to use it as a weapon. She knew, sitting there in the dark, that she had two choices. She could bring the ring and the letters to Queen Rosalind privately, quietly, and let the Queen decide what to do with her own past. Or she could wait and risk letting someone else control how and when the truth came out. She decided, before the candle at her bedside had burned halfway down, that she would go to the Queen herself, not to expose her, not to confront her, but to warn her and to give her the chance to decide her own fate before anyone else could take that choice away from her. What Aloan did not yet know was that Duchess Serafina had already begun laying the groundwork for something far more public. A plan that would unfold at the King and Queen's upcoming 30th wedding anniversary celebration, in front of the entire royal court and half the kingdom's press. The ring that had sat hidden in a wall for 30 years was about to become the center of a storm none of them could yet see coming. Duchess Serafina had never been a woman who moved quickly. She was patient in the way that predators are patient content to watch, to wait, to let others reveal themselves before she made her move. She had learned long ago that in a palace full of careful, guarded people, information was the only currency that truly mattered. And for the first time in years, she believed she was holding something valuable enough to change her family's standing for good. It had started almost by accident. Months earlier, while helping organize old estate records for a charity auction the Queen had asked her to oversee, Serafina had come across a ledger from Millbrook Hollow, the same small village Rosalind had come from before her marriage to King Edmund. Buried among property records was a name that meant nothing to most people but caught Serafina's attention immediately. Callum Doyle, listed as the intended groom in a wedding registration that had never been completed. She hadn't thought much of it at first. Village records were full of such things: canceled engagements, unfinished paperwork. But something about the timing nagged at her. The registration was dated only months before Rosalind's name appeared, for the first time, on the guest list of a royal garden party where she had first been introduced to then Prince Edmund. Serafina was not a cruel woman by nature, though many in the palace whispered otherwise. She told herself again and again that what she was doing was not malicious, simply thorough. She wanted to understand the full picture before deciding what, if anything, to do with it. But the more she learned, quietly asking old villagers, tracking down retired staff who had once worked at the Ashcombe estate, the more she became convinced that this was not a small, forgettable secret. This was the kind of story that could reshape how the public saw their beloved queen. And if handled the right way, revealed publicly, dramatically, at precisely the right moment, it was the kind of story that could reshape a great deal more than public opinion. It could shift the quiet balance of influence within the family itself. Serafina's own branch of the family had long lived in the shadow of the king and queen's direct line. Her father had been a younger brother to King Edmund's father, meaning her position, while comfortable, would never carry the weight or respect given to those closer to the throne. She had spent years watching Crown Prince Tobias and Princess Aloan receive the kind of adoration from the public that she believed, in her private moments of resentment, should have belonged to her own branch of the family. She was clever, capable, and in her own mind, far more suited to influence than either of them. She did not necessarily want the crown. That was never realistic, and she knew it. But she wanted respect. She wanted her voice to matter in the family's decisions. And she had come to believe that the only way to earn that kind of standing was to prove herself indispensable, someone whose discretion, or lack of it, could shape the family's fortunes. The note she had sent to Aloan had been a test, of sorts. She wanted to know who else might be circling the same secret, wanted to gauge how the young princess would react. When word reached her, through a maid loyal to her household, that Aloan had visited the royal archives asking pointed questions about Millbrook Hollow, Serafina understood immediately that her rival for this information, though Aloan likely didn't see herself as a rival at all, was already several steps ahead. That realization pushed her timeline forward. The King and Queen's 30th wedding anniversary celebration was still 6 weeks away, an event already being planned as one of the grandest the kingdom had seen in years. Foreign dignitaries were expected. The press would be out in full force, broadcasting the celebration to every corner of the realm. It was, Serafina had decided months ago, the perfect stage, a moment when the eyes of the entire kingdom would already be fixed on Rosalind, waiting to celebrate 30 years of what everyone believed to be an unshakable storybook marriage. If the truth about Callum Doyle emerged there in front of everyone, it would not simply be a private family matter. It would become the story the entire kingdom talked about for years. And Serafina intended to ensure that when it happened, she would be the one seen offering comfort, wisdom, and stability amid the chaos. The calm, capable relative who had known how to handle the truth when others had been caught off guard. She had not yet decided exactly how she would reveal it. A conversation with a sympathetic journalist, perhaps, timed just right. Or a quiet word to one of the king's older, more traditional advisors, the kind of man who might feel compelled to raise the matter formally, giving her the appearance of having played no direct role at all. She was still weighing her options when she learned that Aloan had visited the queen privately, only 2 days after finding the ring. That news unsettled her more than she expected. Aloan had spent 3 sleepless nights turning the decision over in her mind, before she finally worked up the courage to request a private audience with Queen Rosalind. She chose a quiet afternoon, when she knew the queen would be alone in her private sitting room, away from advisors and staff, tending to the small garden of herbs she kept on her balcony. One of the few purely personal hobbies Rosalind allowed herself amid the demands of royal life. Rosalind looked up when Aloan entered, offering the same warm, easy smile she always gave her daughter-in-law. "Aloan, this is a nice surprise. Come, sit." Aloan sat across from her, the small wooden box resting in her lap, hidden beneath a light shawl. For a moment she almost lost her nerve. Rosalind looked so at peace, snipping small sprigs of rosemary with careful, practiced hands, entirely unaware of the conversation about to unfold. "I need to show you something," Aloan finally said. "And I need you to know that I wasn't trying to pry. I found it by accident in the old West Wing." She placed the box on the small table between them and opened it, revealing the ring nestled in its faded blue cloth. Rosalind went very still. For a long moment she said nothing at all. Her hands, which had been so steady moments before, trembled slightly as she reached out and picked up the ring, turning it over to reveal the engraving inside. Aloan watched something shift in the queen's face, not anger, not the guarded composure she was famous for, but something rawer, something that looked, for the first time in Aloan's memory, like grief that had never fully healed. "Where did you find this?" Rosalind asked quietly. "Bricked into the old fireplace in the study we're renovating. I didn't understand what it meant at first, but I found some old records, some letters at the archive." Aloan hesitated. "I know about Callum. I'm so sorry, Rosalind. I wasn't trying to uncover anything you wanted kept private. I only kept looking because—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Because someone else already knows, and I don't think they intend to keep it quiet." Rosalind's eyes flicked up sharply. "Someone else?" Aloan told her about the note, about her suspicions regarding Duchess Serafina, about the unsettling sense that whoever had sent it intended to use the information rather than simply sit with it. For a long time, the queen said nothing. She simply held the ring, staring at it as though it had the power to pull her backward through 30 years in an instant. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than Aloan had ever heard it. "I was going to marry him," Rosalind said. "Callum, we grew up together in Millbrook Hollow. He was a blacksmith's son, and I was. Nobody important, really, despite the family name. We fell in love the way young people do, foolishly, completely, without thinking about anything beyond the next day." She set the ring down gently on the table, as though it might shatter. "We were 3 months from our wedding when the accident happened at the quarry. He'd taken extra work there to save for our future. I remember the exact moment someone came to tell me. I remember thinking the world had simply stopped." Aloan reached out and took the queen's hand, saying nothing, simply letting her continue at her own pace. "I didn't leave my room for weeks. My mother worried I never would again. And then, almost a year later, my parents arranged for me to attend a garden party at the palace, mostly, I think, to force me back into the world, to give me something to focus on besides grief. I met Edmund there. I wasn't looking for anything. I certainly wasn't looking for love again. But he was patient with me in a way I didn't expect. He never pushed. He simply stayed in whatever way I would let him." She looked up at Aloan, her eyes glistening but her voice steady. "I do love your father-in-law, Aloan, deeply and completely. What I felt for Callum doesn't take anything away from that. But I never told Edmund the full truth, not because I was ashamed, but because grief, when you carry it long enough, becomes something private. Something that belongs only to you. I built a wall around that part of my life, quite literally, it seems, and I never imagined anyone would need to look behind it." "Does the king know anything?" Aloan asked gently. "He knows I loved someone before him in a general sense. Most people who marry later in life have some history. But he doesn't know the details, the wedding that never happened, the ring, any of it. I never saw the need to relive that pain by explaining it, and he never asked me to." Aloan understood in that moment the true weight of what she was holding. This wasn't scandal. This wasn't betrayal. It was simply a woman's private sorrow, something she had every right to keep to herself. And now, because of Serafina's ambitions, that private sorrow was at risk of becoming a public spectacle, twisted into something it was never meant to be. "What do you want to do?" Eloan asked. Rosalind was quiet for a long moment, staring out at her small garden, at the herbs she tended with such quiet devotion. "I think," she said slowly, "it's time I told Edmund myself, properly. Not because anyone is forcing my hand, but because he deserves to hear it from me, not from gossip or some engineered scandal at our anniversary celebration." And then, she added, a note of steel entering her voice that Eloan had rarely heard before, "I think it's time Serafina learned that some doors don't open the way she expects them to." That evening, Queen Rosalind requested a private dinner with King Edmund, away from the usual formalities of their public schedule. Eloan, watching from a distance as the Queen prepared, felt a strange mixture of guilt and relief. Guilt for having disturbed a peace the Queen had carefully built over decades. Relief that Rosalind had chosen honesty over concealment, on her own terms, before anyone else could take that choice from her. King Edmund was a steady man, not given to dramatic reactions, and those who knew him well understood that his calmness in difficult moments was not indifference but deep consideration. When Rosalind sat across from him that evening and told him, gently but honestly, about Callum Doyle, about the wedding that never happened, about the ring hidden away for 30 years, about the grief she had carried quietly through their entire marriage, he listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When she finished, there was a long silence. "Why didn't you tell me?" he finally asked, though his tone held no anger, only genuine curiosity tinged with something softer. "Because for a long time it hurt too much to speak of," Rosalind admitted. "And later, because it simply became a part of myself I kept private, the way everyone keeps some part of themselves private, even from those they love most." Edmund reached across the table and took her hand. "Rosalind, I've never needed you to have no history before me. I only ever wanted you to be happy in whatever way that happiness came to you. If part of your happiness required grieving someone I never had the chance to know, that doesn't diminish what we've built together. It only means you carried something heavy, for a long time, largely alone. I only wish I could have shared that weight with you." Rosalind's composure finally broke, tears slipping free as 30 years of carefully guarded grief found, at last, a place to be spoken aloud rather than hidden behind brick and silence. It was, in many ways, a relief neither of them had expected, the truth, once spoken, proving far lighter to carry than the secret had ever been. But outside their private dinner, the machinery of Duchess Serafina's plan was already turning. She had, in the days following Eloan's visit to the archives, quietly reached out to a journalist known for covering royal affairs, a man named Desmond Ray, whose publication had a reputation for aggressive, attention-grabbing coverage of the family. Serafina had been careful, of course, never directly handing over documents, simply suggesting that Ray might find something worth investigating in old Millbrook Hollow records, dropping just enough detail to point him in the right direction without implicating herself directly. Ray, sensing a significant story, had begun his own investigation almost immediately, moving with a speed and lack of discretion that even Serafina hadn't fully anticipated. By the time King Edmund and Queen Rosalind finished their private dinner, unaware that anything beyond their own household had shifted, Desmond Ray had already confirmed enough details from Millbrook Hollow locals to feel confident running a story, one he intended to publish just days before the royal anniversary celebration, ensuring maximum public attention. Serafina had wanted drama at the anniversary itself. She hadn't accounted for a journalist eager enough and reckless enough to break the story even earlier, entirely outside her control. When Eloan received word the following morning, through a worried call from Mr. Pemberton at the archive, who had heard through his own contacts that a journalist had been making inquiries about the very same records Eloan herself had requested, she understood immediately that the timeline they had all assumed they had was gone. The truth was no longer a private matter the family could choose to reveal on their own terms. It was about to become a headline, and there was very little time left to decide how the family would respond when it did. The news reached the palace's private secretary, Mr. Aldous Finch, at 6 in the morning, delivered by a nervous junior aide who had spent half the night monitoring press inquiries. Desmond Ray's publication, the Kingdom Herald, was preparing to run a story within 48 hours, a story with the working headline, "The Queen's Buried Promise," detailing an alleged secret engagement Rosalind had kept hidden from the king for the entirety of their 30-year marriage. Finch brought the news directly to King Edmund before the sun had fully risen, finding him already awake, standing at the window of his study with the quiet stillness of a man who had spent the night thinking rather than sleeping. "They don't have the full story," Edmund said, after Finch explained what he'd learned. "They have fragments, enough to cause damage but not enough to understand what actually happened. Shall I have the legal office look into an injunction, Your Majesty? We may be able to delay publication, at least until—" "No," Edmund said, cutting him off gently but firmly. "No injunctions, no suppression. That will only make it look as though we have something shameful to hide, and we don't. My wife loved someone before she loved me. She lost him young and cruelly, and she has carried that grief with more grace than most people carry far smaller burdens. I will not have that story twisted into scandal by silence and lawyers." Finch hesitated. "Then how would you like to proceed?" Edmund turned from the window, and for the first time since receiving the news, something resembling calm resolve settled over his features. "Get me Rosalind, and send word to Tobias and Aloan. We're going to handle this ourselves, honestly, before anyone else gets the chance to handle it for us." By mid-morning, the small family had gathered in the king's private study. Edmund, Rosalind, Tobias, and Aloan, along with Finch, who stood ready to coordinate whatever response the family decided upon. Rosalind, though pale, held herself with the same composed dignity Aloan had always admired, though now there was something new beneath it, a kind of quiet defiance, the look of a woman who had spent 30 years protecting a private grief and was no longer willing to let others twist it into something ugly. "I want to speak publicly," Rosalind said, before anyone else could suggest a strategy. "Not through a press statement drafted by committee. Not through carefully chosen phrases meant to control the narrative. I want to tell the truth myself, in my own words, before Ray's story runs." Edmund nodded slowly. "I'll stand beside you." "As will I," Tobias added immediately, glancing at Aloan, who nodded her agreement without hesitation. Finch, ever practical, raised a gentle concern. "Your Majesties, if I may, speaking before the story runs could be seen as reactive, even defensive. It may fuel more speculation rather than less." "Let it," Rosalind said simply. "I would rather the kingdom hear my grief spoken honestly than see it packaged as a scandal by someone who never knew Callum, never knew what those months after his death felt like, and certainly has no right to decide how that story gets told." It was decided, then, as father, mother, son, and daughter-in-law stood together, that the Queen would give a brief, honest address the following afternoon, not a grand press conference, but a simple, direct statement filmed in the palace gardens rather than some sterile press room with only Edmund at her side. Aloan, watching Rosalind's calm determination settle over the room, felt a swell of quiet admiration. This was not a woman who needed rescuing. She simply needed the chance to speak before someone else spoke for her. There remained, however, the question of Serafina. Aloan had shared her suspicions with Tobias days earlier, and now, with the family gathered, she raised them again, carefully, aware of how serious an accusation it was to level against a member of the family without solid proof. "I can't prove she went to Ray directly," Aloan admitted. "But the timing, the note I received, the fact that she would have had access to those Millbrook Hollow estate records through the charity auction, it fits." King Edmund's expression darkened, though he remained composed. "If it's true, it's a serious breach of trust, not simply toward your mother," he said, glancing at Rosalind, "but toward the family as a whole. We cannot function if members of this household believe private matters are theirs to sell for influence." "We don't have proof yet," Tobias cautioned. "We should be careful before confronting her directly." It was Rosalind, surprisingly, who suggested the path forward. "Let me speak with her myself, woman to woman, before any of this becomes an official family matter. I'd like to understand, if it's true, what drove her to it. Perhaps there's something there worth addressing beyond punishment." That afternoon, Rosalind requested a private audience with Duchess Serafina, who arrived at the Queen's sitting room with her usual composed elegance, though Aloan, watching from a nearby corridor at Rosalind's request, could see the faint tension in the Duchess's shoulders, the too careful neutrality of her expression. "You wanted to see me, Your Majesty?" Serafina asked, settling into the chair across from Rosalind. "I did." Rosalind's voice was calm, without accusation, though there was a steadiness to it that made clear this was not a casual conversation. "I understand a journalist has been asking questions about my past. About Millbrook Hollow, specifically." Something flickered across Serafina's face, quickly controlled, but not quickly enough. "I've heard the same rumors, Your Majesty, troubling if true." "Yes," Rosalind said. "Troubling that someone with access to estate charity records, someone who helped organize the very auction where those records were reviewed, would understand exactly where to point a journalist's attention." The room went very quiet. Serafina's composure held, but only barely. "Are you suggesting I had something to do with this?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Rosalind said evenly. "I'm simply observing that very few people had both the access and the motive to connect those particular records to my past. And I find myself curious, Serafina, what exactly you hope to gain by seeing my private grief turned into a public spectacle." For a long moment, Serafina said nothing. When she finally spoke, her carefully maintained composure cracked slightly, revealing something rawer beneath it, not quite remorse, but perhaps the beginning of it. "You've had 30 years of the kingdom's adoration, Your Majesty. 30 years of being seen as the perfect queen, the perfect wife. Some of us have spent our entire lives in the corners of this family, respected but never truly valued, useful but never essential. I thought—" She stopped, swallowing. "I thought if I could show the family, show the kingdom, that even the most trusted among us carry hidden truths, perhaps I would finally be seen as someone whose judgment mattered. Someone worth listening to." Rosalind studied her for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had softened, though it lost none of its firmness. "Serafina, do you understand that what you were prepared to do wasn't clever positioning? It was cruelty dressed up as strategy. You were prepared to take the worst day of my life, the day I lost someone I loved completely, and use it as a tool to raise your own standing. That isn't the behavior of someone who deserves greater trust within this family." "It's precisely the opposite." Serafina's eyes glistened, though she fought visibly to maintain her composure. "I never intended for it to seem so calculated in the moment. I told myself I was simply uncovering a truth." "Every act of cruelty tells itself a comforting story," Rosalind said quietly. "That doesn't make it any less cruel." The conversation that followed was long and difficult, and ultimately ended not with punishment in the traditional sense, but with a quiet ultimatum delivered by King Edmund later that evening. Serafina would issue a private apology to the Queen, would have no further involvement in any family charitable or estate matters requiring access to sensitive records, and would spend the coming months at the family's countryside estate, away from the court, allowing tempers and trust to settle before any decision was made about her future role within royal affairs. It was not banishment, but it was, unmistakably, a consequence, and a clear message that ambition built on betrayal would not be rewarded within the family, no matter how it was dressed up. The following afternoon, as promised, Queen Rosalind stood in the palace gardens beside King Edmund. A small gathering of press assembled at a respectful distance, cameras trained on her steady, composed face. There was no podium, no elaborate staging, simply Rosalind, Edmund at her side, and the quiet garden she had always loved. "I understand there have been questions circulating about my past," Rosalind began, her voice clear and unhurried. "Rather than allow speculation to shape a story that isn't theirs to tell, I'd like to share the truth myself." She spoke then of Millbrook Hollow, of a young blacksmith's son named Callum Doyle, whom she had loved with the uncomplicated devotion of youth, of a wedding that had been planned and never happened, of the quarry accident that took him from her 3 months before they were meant to marry, of the year of grief that followed, and the unexpected, gentle patience of a young prince named Edmund, who had never asked her to forget what she'd lost, only offered her a life alongside a new kind of happiness. "I never told my husband every detail of that time," she admitted, glancing briefly at Edmund, who took her hand without hesitation. "Not because I was ashamed, and not because our marriage was built on anything less than complete love and honesty. Simply because grief, when it runs deep enough, becomes something private, something we sometimes protect not out of secrecy, but out of tenderness for the person we once were." She paused, looking directly at the assembled cameras. "I share this now not because I owe anyone an explanation for a grief that belongs to me alone, but because I would rather my story be told honestly, in my own words, than twisted into something it never was. Callum Doyle was a good man who died far too young. My love for him does not diminish my love for my husband, just as my life now does not erase the life I once hoped to have. Both are simply parts of who I am. Edmund spoke briefly afterward, his voice steady with quiet conviction. My wife has spent 30 years bringing grace and dignity to this family and this kingdom. If anything, learning the depth of what she carried, silently for all these years, has only deepened my respect and love for her. I would ask that the kingdom extend her the same compassion she has always extended to others. The response in the days that followed surprised nearly everyone in the palace. Rather than the scandal Serafina had hoped for, or the salacious spectacle Desmond Ray had intended to publish, the public reaction leaned overwhelmingly towards sympathy and admiration. Editorials praised the Queen's honesty and grace. Ordinary citizens wrote letters expressing their own stories of loss and quiet grief, thanking Rosalind for speaking so openly about something so many carried privately themselves. Ray's story, published a day later than intended, found itself already overshadowed by the Queen's own account, reduced to confirming details she had already shared herself, robbed of the dramatic reveal he had hoped to deliver. Elowen, watching the public reaction unfold over the following days, found herself reflecting often on how close things had come to unfolding very differently. How easily a private grief could have been twisted into a public scandal. Had Serafina's plan gone unchecked? Had Rosalind chosen silence over honesty when the moment demanded courage instead? She found Rosalind a week later in the same garden, tending once again to her small collection of herbs, looking lighter somehow, as though the truth once spoken had lifted a weight she'd carried so long she'd nearly forgotten its shape. "Thank you," Rosalind said, without looking up from her gardening, "for bringing me that ring instead of simply putting it back and pretending you'd never found it." "I almost did," Elowen admitted, settling onto the bench beside her. "It felt like it wasn't mine to disturb." "Perhaps not," Rosalind agreed. "But some things need disturbing eventually. Grief left buried too long begins to feel like shame, even when it never was. I'm glad, in the end, that it came to light on my own terms rather than someone else's." Elowen glanced at the ring, which Rosalind now wore on a simple chain around her neck, no longer hidden behind brick and silence, but held openly, gently, as a quiet part of the woman she had always been. "What will happen with Serafina?" Elowen asked. "She'll have time at the estate to consider what she nearly did," Rosalind said. "Whether she learns from it or simply grows more careful in her ambitions, I suppose we'll see. Not everyone finds their way back from a mistake like that, but I'd rather offer her the chance than close the door entirely. Bitterness rarely improves with punishment alone." The anniversary celebration, when it arrived 6 weeks later, proceeded not as the scene of scandal Serafina had once envisioned, but as a genuine, heartfelt tribute to 30 years of marriage built on a foundation far sturdier than anyone outside the family had ever fully understood, not the absence of complicated history, but the willingness, when it mattered most, to face that history honestly, together, rather than letting it be defined by someone else's ambition. King Edmund, raising a quiet toast at the celebration's close, looked at his wife with the same steady devotion he'd shown her for 3 decades. "To 30 years," he said, "and to every version of the woman I married, the one I've always known, and the one I only recently came to understand more fully. I love her more, not less, for every part of her story." Rosalind smiled, resting her hand over the ring at her collar, and for the first time in 30 years felt no need to hide any part of who she had been, who she had loved, and who she had become. The wall that had once sealed away a small wooden box and the grief hidden inside it was long gone now, replaced by something far sturdier than brick and mortar. Honesty, offered freely on her own terms at last,